Here is a call for a collaborative book. If you can hear me, broadcasting to you from about the middle of nowhere. It's actually a tiny little hamlet called Cabrunas. This collaborative book is an idea called What If? Most of us know by now that Christopher Columbus did not discover the Americas in 1492. He stumbled upon the Bahamian archipelago, beached himself there, and jumped in the turquoise waters of the Caribbean Sea like a pubic hair would land in a hot soup. With his 87 crew members and 3 galleons, while in search of a new route to Asia. Meanwhile, some 500 years earlier, that is in the early 10th century, the Vikings had landed in what is now known as the northeastern coast of North America and had established trade routes as far north as now called Canada and as far south as with the Seminole tribes of now called Florida. Christopher Columbus called the indigenous people he found there Indians because he thought he had found India. What an idiot. Would it be fair then to judge this seasoned seaman a moron, a true adventurer, the luckiest man in history, the most spineless man in history, the cruelest man in history, or other not so flattering names? An idea stemmed after viewing an interesting documentary by National Geographic on the situation of the Americas before Columbus, before 1492. Damn car, one every hour. Before the next 500 years of evolution as we know it. The idea is simple, yet challenging. What if Columbus had never made it to shore? Some 3 months after he set sail from the Spanish coast? What if the Americas had never been, quote, discovered, unquote, by Europeans? How would the world have evolved? Before going further with that premise, let's set the historical context in Europe and the Americas circa 1492. Keep in mind that the facts presented before you have been gathered in notes from the above-mentioned documentary. This book should not be approached as a historical novel, but as a collaborative work of fiction, and more on that later. The situation in Europe in the late 15th century was, and some would compare it to what it is today in terms of environmental measures, dire. The old continent was populated by some 100 million people, with an advanced society in constant growth that was fast depleting its natural resources. Wood had been cut at an alarming rate to construct dwellings and forts. Wars and battles had also consumed a lot of wood. And bustling cities such as Paris, Florence, Venice, Amsterdam, London, or Madrid demanded more supplies every day. 2 cars in 1 hour. The land was being stretched to capacity and beyond, and fallow land was unproductive for cycles of 3 years. The seas were overexploited, and the expanding cattle lands did not leave enough space for sustainable farming. Over the span of hundreds of years, Europeans had learned to harness wind and water for power and had domesticated animals for their needs. If new trade routes, new territories were not found fast, the European population would face famine and might even come on the brink of extinction. European people had been victims of their own development, commerce, and success. I'm watching where I step because I'm on the edge of a cliff, in case you hadn't noticed. Christopher Columbus received the approval of Queen Isabella, by far the most influential ruler in Europe at the time. as a mean to save the European population, as he promised her riches and new territories, and her greed more so than the survival of entire populations, 3 cars in 1 hour. Sealed the deal for him to leave Spain in search of a way to deliver on his promise to the Queen. Moreover, it did not cost her a fortune for Columbus to embark on a quest with 3 galleons and a bunch of outcasts. The whole endeavor appeared to be a good investment in her eyes. Her wealth had dwindled due to the Turks and the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, she needed a way to circumvent that situation too. What Columbus initially discovered was a pristine land, a hot climate, a lush landscape which appeared to have abundant fauna and flora. It is only when he came back in 1493 with an expedition of 17 galleons, which were dispatched beyond the Bahamas and sent toward the coast of, now called Florida, Central and South America, that they grasped the extent of the discovery. There were now settlers over 600,000 miles of coastlines, tens of millions of species and abundant fish in the seas. They had stumbled upon a magnificent bounty that would guarantee Columbus fame and fortune, and far more than the good graces of Queen Isabella. On the other hand, the situation in what is now called North, Central, and South America was quite different. Mesoamerica, or now Central America, was densely populated with great civilizations, such as Mayas, Incas, Aztecs, and overall the entire American continent housed 100 million people, 4 cars in 1 hour, the same as in Europe, but on a territory 10 times the size of Europe. Their civilization was one which respected land and native species and only consumed what they needed for survival. Hence, there seemed to be an inexhaustible source of wildlife and plants from which to live on. They lived in small tribal villages composed of trading posts and were sharing their crops. It had taken them about 1,000 years to be able to farm corn, which did not exist in Europe, which was almost a guarantee of a great civilization. 5 fucking cars in less than 10 minutes. However, the Inca Empire had the particularity of living off their own treasure. The potato as early as 8,000 years ago, although it was still unknown in Europe. These great civilizations had created, through collective and cooperative work, terraces to plant crops in places where the steep landscapes would have made it otherwise impossible. They had not domesticated animals other than llamas and alpacas, which they used for meat and fur, but not to help them work the land, unlike Europeans with horses and oxen. They had domesticated the land to attract and hunt sustainably wild animals, such as the 30+ million bisons that roam freely in America then. They did not have guns or horses. That would come later, much to their initial fondness, later to their demise. And hunted for food, whereas at the same time I'm missing a page here. At the same time in Europe, hunting was already a sport, practiced for fun and prestige amongst the noblemen. In 1491, Europeans did not have meat available for at least 100 days a year, and their demand for fish was huge. By 1300, thousands of tons of dried fish were exported from Norway to Britain every year. In 1491, the overfishing had depleted supplies in rivers and seas. In the Americas, their rivers were pristine and plentiful. and their seas were likewise abundant. That is because the local population would never take more than they needed and were respectful of nature and their surroundings. In the Americas, North and South Americas of the late 15th century appear to be a primitive, untamed paradise, when in actuality the indigenous populations lived in harmony with nature and had a peaceful societal system that allowed them to do that because they knew that it was the key to their survival, unlike the Anasazis, who from 700 to 1130 had overexploited their land in what is now New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, and had disappeared. However, in Europe, the development of modern society led them to overexploit wood, overcrowd cities to the point that Europeans needed new inventions, new ideas, and new territories for survival. Most of us know what the European invasion has meant for North and South America native population, but few of us know that within 40 years the Inca and Aztec empires had fallen, that as many as 90% of the native population had died because of diseases such as mostly smallpox, measles, and influenza brought by Europeans, and by the domesticated animals such as the pig, which decimated their crops that were unprotected without fencing. Within 20 years after the arrival of Columbus and his fleet, there were as many as 30,000 pigs just on the island of Cuba alone. 50 years after Columbus' arrival, the conquistadors found no one in their way. No one. Within 300 years, the initial few domesticated horses released on the North American land had become what is now called the Mustang, 150 million dispatched over North America, along with the cattle, had contributed to the near extinction of the native bisons and had forever changed the landscape of North and South America. Spaniards left ruins behind when they had originally found riches and splendor. When the British settled in Virginia in the early 17th century, there was no one in North America except for about 14,000 natives in small clustered habitats. Despite the abundance of fish in rivers, the European had overfished the Americas within 200 years and contributed to the greatest destruction of forest in history by sending back to Europe vast tonnage of cut trees and other goods for commerce. Hence, they created this new world in the image of the one that they had left, yet change the local landscape irrevocably in the process. It is with this historical context and the knowledge of our world today that we have gathered, that I would like to gather, several writers or even aspiring writers to create a new fictional world stemming from a few basic questions. What if Columbus and his crew had never reached the shores of the Bahamian archipelago? What if they had perished at sea? What if they had made it to Africa instead? What if they had made it there, but most of them had perished during the voyage, and only a handful had made it to shore without the possibility of coming back and leaving the Bahamas? What if Spain had never seen them again? What I wish for is a group of writers, each of them expert in their specific style, to take a challenge of rewriting history, of creating a fictional world based on these few what-ifs. They will contribute a chapter and a continuum in this alternative world using the initial premise and their imagination for your reading pleasure. Will you take that challenge? if you will, get with Eric, Jeffrey, or Brian if you want to get in touch with me or if you want to discuss it with them. Thank you for listening.